Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Liam Scandrett. I'm Senior Business Development Manager for Spirits in the Europe, Middle East and Africa region at WSET. It's a pleasure to welcome you to this webinar. The WSET, for those that don't know, is the world's leading provider of wine, spirits and sake qualifications. Our qualifications are designed to inspire and empower anyone looking to develop their drinks knowledge, from beginners to experts and from enthusiasts to professionals. Pisco, the topic of today's webinar, is covered in WSET levels 2 and 3 in spirits. And it's a category that I love, very unique in many senses and complex, intense, with a real pure and interesting expression of fruit and floral aromas that's underpinned by some real unique variables, by some distinctive production features, which I think will be really interesting to explore over the course of the next 20 to 30 minutes. So it's my pleasure to welcome Diego Loret de Mola, who's with me today, who's going to be presenting over the next 20 minutes or so and sharing his wealth of knowledge, probably the man most responsible for promoting Peruvian Pisco globally and taking it to more markets than anybody else in the world. So without further ado, I'll pass over to Diego. I will remind everybody as well that this will be available via YouTube after the recording's finished. And if you have any questions during the session, then please put them in the Q&A box at the bottom. Diego.
Liam, how are you?
I'm well, sir. How are you?
Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to come and share a little bit of my passion with such a great audience. I hear there's about 260 people in this audience, and I'm sure everybody is very well interested in Pisco, not only because they want to hear from me, but actually because they love the whole atmosphere around it. So thank you, everybody, for being present today from wherever you are in the world. It's a pleasure for me to be here and to talk about Pisco, what we call the liquid diamond, the essence of Peru. And I'm going to do my best to be able to summarize in 20 minutes a spirit that has more 450 years of existence in the world. And it's been through everything, you know, politically, tradition, culture, all sorts of different scenarios over this time. And unfortunately disappeared from the world for 3 decades, the 70s, 80s, and 90s. But we are so happy that in the last 20 years, it's become a category again that is growing beautifully every year. More people are getting aware of it, experiencing it, and more countries in the world are trying it out. So without further ado, when we think of Pisco, inevitably we have to think of wine and think of grapes and their behavior, depending on terroir, depending on climate, depending on what part of the world they come from, or what region within a DO. Pisco is no different to that. But how did Pisco come about? Then we have to go back to history. The first grapes were brought to Peru in 1539. We know that Hernan Cortez did his job in 1520, bringing the grapes into Central America. But by 1532, Francisco Pizarro had already reached the country where today is Peru, which was the land of the Incas, the Tawantinsuyo. That was the focus of the crown, to be able to govern the richest part of the New Americas, which at the time was the Inca Empire. And if you see at the beginning, when the first colonies were segregated and moved and put together, Charles V had this idea of putting them in bands. And if you see the Nueva Castilla band, was that area where most of the Inca Empire lied. Over time, in 1542, you had a more consolidated area, which was the Viceroyalty of Peru, which continue with that shape and changing a little bit geographically depending on the political movements until the 1800s, right before independence. And there's a common denominator in those maps and what was going on at the time. And that, I point out, is the port of Pisco. The port of Pisco at the time became the best entry for the conquerors to be able to reach with their ships to the coast and be able to find a pathway through the Andes into Cusco, because Cusco was the capital of the Inca Empire and they needed to control it. So and all of a sudden, you start seeing a lot of traffic going north-south. The Magallanes Strait wasn't used because it was very, very risky at the time. But the path was, from Panama, from the Central America area to Peru, through the port of Pisco into Cusco. And that developed a lot of commerce, which eventually, brought a lot of development in the area. And when the Spaniards arrived to this bay, which was perfectly set up, shallow, and had this opening with the valley of Pisco going up the mountains into the pathway to Cusco, they realized that the terroir was amazing for viticulture. And even though the first grapes were planted in 1539 in Lima, by 1542, we had a tremendous amount of grapes being planted in the Pisco area. And the further south they moved, looking for that extra additional pathway into Cusco, they found that the terroir and the land south of Lima into Pisco, into Ica, and all the way down to the end of where the Tahuantinsuyo property of the Incas, kingdom of the Incas, ended up with the viceroyalty of Peru, was perfect for growing grapes. So that became inevitably a land that was essential for vineyard and viticulture. Grapes were not native from the Americas. They were brought by the Spaniards, as well as the distillation concept. So everything started here in this land of Pisco. And why was it called Pisco? Because Pisco was a word that in the Quechua language meant bird. It was the land of the bird, and today you can still find in the area a preserve, government preserve, for the seabird wildlife called Paracas. If you ever have a chance to go down to Peru, take the time. It's really beautiful and gives you great perspective. And that piscus, piscos, piscuis, phonetically sounded like Pisco in Spanish. And therefore, they baptized the area as the land of Pisco. And obviously, the river, the valley, the port, and the territory was named after this bird. And you can see even in the pre-Columbian cultures before they arrived, the piscu was well represented in their ceramic, in their tapestries, in many of the antiques that we have found that are 15 or more years, 100 years old. Even the amphora, the concept of the amphora was brought also by the Spaniards. It was an Arab concept that came with the Moors, and it was used for transferring liquids. And there were different shapes, but this particular shape was used for fermenting first the wine, then you washed it, and after distillation, the distillate was kept in these amphoras. At the beginning, the Spaniards did not bring cask to age their product, and they used these ceramic vats to hold it and rest the product, as well as to transport it to the different areas along the Pacific. And what they soon found was that the product really evolved. It did not need wood to soften. The product evolved itself and actually expressed a lot better the fruit that it became from, because there was not only one type of grape, there were several types of grapes, and each one expressed its own characteristics after a while. And this ceramic amphora eventually took the name of the Pisco amphora. So it was a ceramic jar that was made in the area of Pisco. Most of the kilns were there, and in the Ica Valley, which is only just 40 kilometers south. And these amphoras got to be known as the amphoras of Pisco, the botija of Pisco, to the extent that commercially, whomever ordered a Pisco would order it just by its name. Would you bring me a Pisco, 5 gallons? Would you bring me a Pisco of 10, 15, 16, 20 gallons? So over a period of time, this brandy that was distilled in the area of Pisco took the name of the area. You no longer call brandy of cognac, you call it cognac. Same thing happened here. Brandy of Pisco became Pisco. The amphora was the vessel in which it was transported in. So calling it a Pisco means bring me an amphora of Pisco. And of course, the port of Pisco was the main port where it was exported from. That's where we start with defining that the brandy has a denomination of origin, and that denomination of origin was adopted by the area where most of this wine was produced. So starting with Lima and going south to Pisco, Pisco sits within the state of Ica, and from there, there's another 3 states, Arequipa, Moquegua, and Tacna. And that is where the denomination of origin, the designation of the region for Pisco is now inscripted in the rules and regulations of how we make it and where we make it. The DO demands that the grapes have to come from the area, the product has to be produced in the area and bottled in the area before it can be shipped out. You cannot make bulk Pisco and then bottle it somewhere else. You cannot make this brandy outside of the DO and bottle it in Cusco or the north, the jungle. It will only be called brandy, otherwise has to be from the DO. And those are the 5 regions. The 5 regions are coastal areas south of Lima, and the DO calls for up to 2,000 meters above sea level. Above that, then it will be called brandy. So you have to maintain all the process of production within that region. The original grapes were the missionary grapes, and they were brought by the Spaniards that wanted to conquer the viceroyalty of Peru, the Tawantinsuyo, the Incas, in the name of God, with sacramental wine. So the original wines were wines that were very rich in sugars, so that you could fortify the wines, church wine. And eventually those wines became part of the distillation process, specifically in the mid-1600s, around 1641, 42, when Philip II banned the exportation of any wines coming from the Newfoundland to the old continent. And therefore, in order to preserve it, distillation was intensified. So it started as part of their, customary distilling process, or custom of doing brandy, and then it became intensified and became commercial. To me, Pisco was the first commercial spirit of the Americas. And we have the grapes. The grapes, the original grapes, we qualify them as less aromatic and more aromatic. The original grapes were the Negra Criolla and the Moyar. We can find DNA ascending back to Spain, which you can find it clearly as grapes that were grown there, picked up somewhere along the way, probably Canary Islands, and then brought into the viceroyalty of Peru, planted along the way. But this Negra Criolla, called Mission grape, you can find similar grapes in Southern California, Mexico, Central America. It might be called Criolla Chic in Argentina. It might be called País in Chile, after the missionaries really complemented going to every part of the territory in their colonization period. But these 2 grapes actually found great terroir home in the southern coastal area of Peru. And the hybrid of crossing the Moyar and Negra Criolla made the Cabranta. So the Cabranta is really a native grape of Peru. You can't track the DNA back into the lineage of grapes into Spain or Europe. So therefore, we're very proud to say that the Cabranta is the native hybrid that developed in Ica. In the state of Ica, we have 5 valleys, Chincha, Pisco, where everything started, Ica, which is the longest valley in the whole Pacific, in the whole coastal area of Peru. And then you have Palpa, Nazca. All of them are great regions, for growing all sorts of agriculture, but specifically for viticulture is just a great place to grow grapes. And the uvina, it's a small grape that actually wasn't part of this brandy production era until probably in the late 80s and 90s. Before that, it was a grape, pretty much like a Cabernet Franc, used to add color and depth to wines. But during the crisis in Peru, this valley developed, the brandy, calling it Pisco, and eventually was incorporated as the last grape to be part of the less aromatic grapes in the Pisco category. The more aromatic grapes actually came to Peru with Italian migration, pretty much, end of the 1700s, beginning of the 1800s. And they are descendants of Muscat grapes. There's many Muscat style grapes, but we received in Peru primarily the Muscat of Alexandria, which we call Italia, the Moscato Bianco, which is Torontel, and in some parts of Italy are called Torontel, and then the Moscatel Rosso that we call it Moscatel Rosso, which most likely it's a descendant of the Moscatel from Hamburg. Albilla is still a Spanish grape that came from Castilla-La Mancha and was also part of the light, more aromatic and fruity grapes. So when you think Pisco and you think grapes, the beauty of it is that we can make 8 different varietals of Pisco because each one of these grapes will have different aromas and flavors, textures. They'll express themselves in different ways. And because in Pisco regulations, we cannot manipulate the wines in any direction, but the natural direction of what the grape will produce. The beauty of Pisco is a very unique spirit, 100% made from grapes where no additives come into play. So we cannot have any yeasts that are not the natural native yeast from the grape. We cannot add enzymes or any type of acid in order to balance and manipulate the wine into the final product. And finally, it gets distilled while the product is still young. So once we have a young wine recently fermented, that's what goes into the copper pot, which has to be of a specific type that I'll talk a little bit later. And then we distill, the product once, cutting head and tails, and the final product goes to rest. And when we bottle it, we do not dilute it with water and bring it to proof. So the proof at which it comes out of the alembic is the final proof that eventually will go into the bottle. That makes it to be a very, very unique spirit. And that's what I call it a liquid diamond, because unlike other spirits that are transparent and see-through, Pisco has this brilliancy that actually is brought by the natural alcohol being concentrated and the additional water that is extracted directly from the wine that is made from during the process. And one of the biggest qualifications of the Pisco is that you have to be you have to look at that brilliancy as you see it into the light. Could be transparent, like many others, but this one shines while others don't shine as much. The different aromas and flavors of these grapes is what is making Pisco today be noticed. Not only the Pisco that we use to make a Pisco sour or a punch, but actually these aromatics that actually is stimulating bartenders' creativity to go and try different super creative cocktails to show the different great aromas, florality, fruitiness, softness, textures. Some of these grapes may be a little, more viscous. Some of them are going to be a little lighter. And that's what makes this category so much fun. When we make Pisco, we can make it from these 8 grapes, but we classify it in 3 types. Something that we call puro, which basically is from fully fermented musts. So, you crush the grape, you get juice. As the juice ferments, and creates alcohol from the sugar, becomes a must. So you go juice, must, and finally, when all the sugar is converted into alcohol, it's wine. That wine, recently fermented is what we distill. So puro, you have to go through the whole process and finally obtain a wine that will range anywhere between 11.5% and 13% alcohol, depending on the amount of alcohol that you harvest your grapes at. And therefore, you can have 8 types of Pisco Puro. We have something else called Mosto Verde, green must. Green alluding at the must is not ripe. So ripe must will be wine, right? All the alcohol converted into, all the sugar converted into alcohol. When we talk about green, means it's at the beginning of this process, and therefore you have a lot of residual sugar. You have a lot of fruitiness because the grapes were recently crushed. And when you distill this, the texture, the expression of aromas are completely different than or put it this way, are more intensified than the regular puro. It's a really great experience. Mosto Verdes tend to be smooth, soft. Mosto Verdes have this incredible finishing, a lot of elegance to their finish. While the puros tend to be a little more robust, a little fuller. You would do shaken cocktails with the puro. You do stir cocktails with the Mosto Verde. In Peru, we tend to drink both straight, depending on what kind of mouthfeel you enjoy more with your Pisco. And finally, we have our blends. So Acholado means blended, which means that it's a blend of 2 or more grape varietals. There's no rule to it. Basically, every master blender will use the grapes that they feel they can handle better and make their own Acholado. So you can have an Acholado of puros and an Acholado of Mosto Verdes. Here is a good example of how you might perceive, many brands presenting their products. Color coding has helped people identify a little bit better. Sometimes you won't remember Cabranta or Torontel or Italia or Moscatel, but you might, remember the color coding, for it. And the color codings sometimes repeat themselves on the Mosto Verde. So if you can see, you will have the Cabranta and the Mosto Verde Cabranta, Italia, Mosto Verde Italia, Torontel, Mosto Verde Torontel. In the center, you have an Acholado. The Acholado is an Acholado of puros. So it is the blending of 3 of these puros, as a matter of fact. The Cabranta, the Italia, and the Torontel. Most likely, you'll see that a substantial portion of an Acholado will always be a base of Cabranta. Is not as much for the price, which the Cabranta tends to be the lower because it's the most abundant Pisco grape produced in Peru. I would venture to say probably is around 80%, 85% of all Piscos will be Cabranta. But also because the Cabranta being not as complex as the more aromatic ones, gives a very good structure and base for then put some of the aromatics on top and give it a little stir them in a certain manner. Sometimes if the Acholado is too perfumey, it will be much closer to having a puro aromatico. Production. The production process is pretty straightforward and simple, but what happens in Peru is we have to be perfect at doing it. Why? Because we have no chance to correct an error. What do I mean by that? It means that the product runs its natural course. when we harvest, which is the first part of the process, those grapes, the moment that you are, putting them in the crates and bringing them to the reception and crush, already starting their fermentation. In the crush, they open up, oxygen is exposed to the juice, and the fermentation starts because of the dirt that is around the skins of the grape. So we use the native yeasts of the grape that are in the skins of the grape to ferment. So we crush them, we remove the stems, so we destem it, and then the mass, which would be the skins, the pulp, the juice with the grape, including seeds, will go into maceration tanks where they will spend together maybe 12 to 24 hours before the skins separate from the juice. The juice is then pumped into the fermentation tanks, and whatever is left of pulp skins is brought to a pneumatic press that is gently pressed, and the last part of the juice is recovered. Normally, in our case, we would separate it because it would have a little bit more tannic acid, and therefore we like to make that Pisco separately. It's not a lot, it's about 2% of the whole crush. But if we talk about the traditional way of making Pisco, where you stomp on the grapes, and is that in a very, very, old traditional artisanal manner, it's a little bit different, it's a little more inefficient. When you step on the grape, you probably, are really stomping hard on that stem. That stem, normally will bring a little bit of, sap into the game, which is a little bit bitter. You probably crush, the seeds and the skins of the grapes, which actually added a little bit more tannic acid. That's what old Pisco tend to be a little bit rougher, was a little bit stronger. Nowadays, with the development of great winemaking equipment, Pisco has improved its quality over the last 20 years because we are using, even though maintaining our artisanal tradition, better equipment to handle the grape and actually make a better wine. So once the grapes have been removed and the juice has naturally fermented, that natural wine is immediately passed on to the alembic. The alembic has to be specifically of Charente style. So we do incorporate that alembic that cognac uses with a wine warmer, the pot, the capitel onion shaped top, and the swan neck shape. And that by law has to be all copper. So every part of that alembic that the vapors, of the alcohol evaporated and then condensed have to be copper. So the spiral inside the chiller will be copper. Chiller doesn't have to be copper because it's not in touch with the product, but any part that will be in touch with the product has to be made of copper. Normally, our harvest will start in end of January in some places, at the peak in February, and then March, April, sometimes so it can be carried into May depending on the summer. And we pick up our grapes at very, very high sugars compared to many other brandies in the world. The sugars are normally measured in Brix or Baume degrees. In Brix, they range around 23 to 26 Brix, which is quite high compared to other brandies that are picked up at 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 Brix, and therefore those need double distillations. In our case, because we made our wines, with such high sugar content grapes, the wines bear high levels of alcohol, and that allow us to just do one single distillation. We do a batch process. Every batch is single distilled because of the high level of alcohol in the wine. It permits us to actually obtain a reasonable volume of spirit with alcohols that will range anywhere between 38 and 48 by law. Most of the Piscos that you'll find available will range probably between 41 and 43, and basically distilled to bottle proof. Our mission as a winemaker, we like to grab those grapes, taste them, really appreciate that beautiful fragrance, flavor, and then we want to transfer and concentrate those organoleptic properties into those wines naturally. And then those wines, we want to concentrate alcohols, flavors, and aromas into the final distillate that we are producing. So basically, if I want to give you a little range, when we make, a puro Pisco, we will probably, use anywhere between 5.5, 6 kilos of grapes to about 7 or 8. In essence, 4 to 5 bottles of wine make 1 bottle of Pisco. When we make the Mosto Verde, the partially fermented must Pisco, it's a different ballgame, because instead of spending maybe 15 to 25 days fermenting, those Piscos ferment maybe a couple days, 2 or 3 days maximum. So there's a lot of sugar remaining. Maybe there's some alcohol anywhere between 6-8%. And then immediately, while it's still fermenting, we send them to the copper pot, apply heat, which stops the fermentation, and then we distill. So the yield is a little bit different. And therefore, the equivalent would be maybe 10, 12, sometimes 14 bottles of wine, of this partially fermented wine, to the same bottle of Pisco. So, that equates that we're going to be using probably somewhere around 10, 12 kilos of grapes or more. And that creates a completely sublime, different, delicious Pisco. So every time that we're making our Pisco, we're thinking, what are we going to do with it? What would be the purpose of it? How do we want it to be consumed? Because one thing is we want a great quality product, and the other is what are they going to do with it, and how do we, motivate the person consuming it, or the bartender transforming it into a cocktail, what to achieve. So we're very, very receptive about, listening to, creativity and what bartenders are going to do, so that we can really, calibrate the quality of the grapes that we are using for Pisco. Finally, Pisco's rest. By law, the minimum resting time is 3 months. 3 months in inert vats. So by inert could be stainless steel, could be cement, could be clay, glass, or until now, food grade polyethylene tanks are still permitted, although pretty soon it seems like the norm will change and prevent us from using those. So what has been going on with Pisco lately, and why are we hearing so much about it? And the truth is, it's been hitting the mark. Finally, it's a category that has reached, the most used spirits, of 2021, Pisco number 10. And it's been consumed tremendously, barely in the last few years as a result of the pandemic. I think that the pandemic gave people the chance to go and explore and review. And if you can see, the growth of Pisco organically in dollars was about 12% before pandemic, and it was like 13%, 14% in liters or cases. The last 2 years has been crazy. It's been, 68% in dollars and 75% in liters, which gives us, the message that Pisco is back. Pisco is a category. Pisco is getting into every, great bar, and it's only represented by the best bars in the world, telling us that now, the Pisco Sour is on number 20, of the top 50 cocktails, and the Pisco Punch, which is the first cocktail ever made with Pisco in the mid-1800s in San Francisco, actually is on position 50. So for us, after this long pilgrimage, spreading the Pisco gospel, we're starting to see recognition on those cocktails. And there's many more cocktails that are being, recognized. The Chilcano, which is, basically a buck, with pisco, lime juice, and ginger ale, a little bit of bitters, one of the classics, actually has now surpassed the consumption of pisco in this cocktail over the pisco sour in Peru. Amazing. And El Capitan, another great cocktail, which is equal parts of vermouth and pisco, both of them, descending from Italian customs. They arrived, the consumption of these cocktails in the early 1900s, late 1800s, when the Italians arrived. And today, tonic. I mean, tonic has grown so much that there's nothing easier than making a pisco tonic. We call it TNT, a Torrentine tonic. Very refreshing and very easy to consume. But this is the future. The future is contemporary cocktails. And as more bartenders are discovering, the great versatility of pisco, the great variety of all this pisco, made from different grapes, I can see the future of pisco being great. It's basically a natural product. The grape is the only ingredient. There's no manipulation, but the honest, process and vigilance of a master blender really trying to achieve putting into the spirit the best quality of the grapes that he has harvested. And the bartenders, we gotta thank them all, because this creativity is only giving pisco a great opportunity to keep on growing. And with that, I hope that my 20 minutes, are up. I think they were up a long time ago. I definitely want to see you in Peru, and my house is open to yours. Every time you want to show up, I'll be there for 4 months during the harvest. So if you can make it down there, I'll be glad to be with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Diego, and thank you for everyone watching. We've had some amazing questions coming in, Diego, both in the chat and in the Q&A, which I've addressed a great deal of, and you've answered quite a few of them in regards to best ways to drink pisco in those final few slides there. So I think with that we can wrap up, and I can ask everybody to give us some feedback in the poll. Thank Diego, and thank everybody for joining us. Just as a reminder, this will be available via the WSET Events Hub on our YouTube channel. So please check it out there. And Diego and I have already joked that we can probably do another 5 or 6 sessions on the unique history of Peruvian pisco. So watch this space for part 2 coming soon.